Alright, so we're going to take just a minute to talk about Chapter 2. This won't be a long lecture because it's fairly intuitive. I'm just going to challenge you to be ethical as you speak, and we're going to talk about some ways that you can be ethical and some unfortunate ways you cannot. So this is Leopold Pilch. He's a very important historical figure. He was Hitler's teacher in many different areas, and he was a wonderful public speaker. And a lot of Hitler's ability to speak publicly came from Leopold Pilch coaching him and then just obviously observing him. Pilch also carried many of the anti-Semitism and philosophies that Hitler then inherited. And so I bring up Leopold Pilch because he's a haunting figure for me. Right, what would have happened if Hitler had never met Leopold Pilch and had never had that temptation to empower himself to speak publicly? And Hitler wasn't the only wonderful public speaker that used that weapon for evil. Like I said, Mussolini and Stalin, all of these guys were really good public speakers, but so was Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela and Abraham Lincoln and many of these people who were proponents of civil rights. So just want to say once again that public speaking is a responsibility and one that shouldn't be taken too lightly. So what do I mean when I say ethics in general? What do I mean by ethics? It's just your ability to establish right and wrong, good and bad thought and in your actions. So for your own personal ethics, we just want to make sure that you are living up to the code of representing Motlow well, and that you are representing your family, America, all of these things with the utmost respect. So, what rhetoric are you using? What words are you choosing to say? We talked about connotation last time. Connotation can happen through just the way that you talk about somebody, right? Maybe you have a conversation about the poor, but you constantly say, they are poor and we are rich. Right? And you constantly have that us-them language about the poor, rather than thinking of them as fellow humans, fellow citizens on this earth. You create this sort of us and them mentality. Or maybe when you're talking about an issue like abortion, you only talk to the women in the class, or you only speak about women's responsibilities in a situation involving abortion. And that rhetoric is one-sided. That rhetoric is short-sighted when it could be that men have a greater responsibility in pregnancy than we might think. So what rhetoric are you using? What word choices? What connotations do your words have? And that can be very, very important. And there is an entire job, a rhetorician. There are entire people who just sit down and look at, speeches from former times and see who are the us and who are the them and what word does this mean. Are they religious? We can tell by just looking at the choices of words. We look at somebody like Shakespeare. He did a lot of quoting from the Bible, so it's safe to assume that he was living in Christendom at the time, or at least reading his Bible some. In general, should you be biased? Now, when you're giving your persuasive speech, you are going to have a bias. You're going to be telling us that we should not be doing something, that we should be doing something. But then there are other times, like in your informative speech, when we want to stay away from bias. We want to avoid taking sides, as it were. And some of you, when you get into real world situations, you'll be the negotiator, maybe between a parent and a child if you go into education. And you're going to have to be careful not to be biased, not to take sides. The government sometimes requires us not to have a bias. For example, if you were telling someone that they had cancer and then offering them different treatment paths. Well, if you happen to be funding this experimental treatment, it would be unethical for you to persuade someone to take this treatment you're funding if it's not in their best interest. You want to try to feign not having an opinion so that that person can make an opinion for themselves, especially on something as important as their treatment options. So bias is sometimes appropriate. It's not always inappropriate, but it often is unfair. I'm going to challenge you to pick on somebody your own size. Don't stand up and talk about, like we said last time, Sarah Silverman saying she wanted to adopt a retarded baby, right? Picking on the person in the schoolyard who can't defend themselves is just unethical. It just doesn't make sense. Are you telling someone, are you tearing someone down when they're not there to defend ourselves, right? Are you going to tell me a story about how stupid your mom is in front of everyone when your mom isn't there to hear the speech, and your mom may not appreciate you sharing personal information about her or her lifestyle in front of everybody else? And I'm going to challenge you to never do this. Never talk bad about someone else in your speech, because you never know who's listening. You never know who is in the room. So please refrain from publicly humiliating anybody. So this may seem pretty obvious, don't lie, but it happens surprisingly often, especially in the speech and debate world. I used to judge a lot of international speeches where people were supposed to have stayed current on these big issues, for example, the war in Iraq. And people would just fabricate sources. They would just say, according to The Economist in July of 2012, when it's still 2010. So they have obviously not read this article from The Economist. They're making up a source and just lying because they didn't do their research efficiently enough. Recently there was a big scandal of a New York Times writer just creating a quote from John Lennon that John Lennon never said. And, there was a lot of public disgrace in the journalism world because he had fabricated that quote. Don't put words in anybody's mouth. Don't ever say that somebody said something when they didn't, because that is unethical. Please don't lie. Your book talks about this pretty extensively. Choose your topic wisely. What you may think is a joke could end up affecting someone negatively. Don't give a speech on how to perform a surgery that you don't know how to perform because you're getting your associate's degree, right? You don't have a doctorate in performing surgery yet, so it's not fair for you to try to tell people how to perform surgery. So always choose a topic you know something about. Your joke could lead to disaster, right? You could jokingly tell someone how to make a bomb, and then they go home and blow up their hand, and you're partially responsible for that. So like I said, there's a big responsibility in public speaking. Are you wasting our time? Is this topic even relevant to speak about, right? And sometimes that just comes into play when you're thinking about your audience demographic. What do they care about? What do they want to hear a speech on? Or what do they need to hear a speech on? Not necessarily what they want to hear a speech on, but are you wasting their time? Are you boring them? Have you not done your research enough? Or are you just kind of rambling on? You have a responsibility when you're taking up the time of everybody in the room. I feel like I've said responsibility 20 times in the last 5 minutes. So as you pick your evidence, right, this is perhaps the most important thing. If you don't get anything else out of this lecture, please hear me here. Whatever you base your argument on when you're speaking publicly, you need to make sure that you clearly understand that from the book or from the newspaper, that you represent it fairly, and that your original source is worthy of your discussion and bringing up, right? The same would be true if we were having a conversation. You would say, oh, I heard so-and-so, and that's so subjective. That's so speculative. You want to make sure that you have your source and that it is current, right? I love the example in your textbook about breast cancer. A student stood up to give a speech about breast cancer and said the primary treatment is a mastectomy, which means to cut off the breast. And that was outdated as a source. That was not the most current information. And so therefore, it was unethical to present. You need to make sure that if you're speaking about a topic, what is out there right now. And this can kind of come into play when we're talking about current issues that are changing constantly. If you're going to do a current issue presentation, you need to make sure that you have the up-to-the-date news. This happened to me when I was teaching speech and debate. I had a wonderful student, Amari Stimley, and he was talking about the cave and the miners who had fallen into and were coming out of, and his speech was, let's continue thinking about the miners and let's support their families, and it was kind of a tribute speech to them. Well, they were rescued, and his speech, before he got a chance to give his speech. And he had an ethical question to ask himself. Should I use that breaking news, or should I give the speech as if they were still in the cave, the way that I've practiced the speech? And so it can always be sort of a question, and the ethical thing to do is always to update your information. So, and that is a valid excuse for prolonging your deadline. If you want to come to me and say, I was going to give my speech on Tuesday, but it looks like there's been a development in my current issue, if I could push that back to Thursday, then that is a fair and reasonable, and the reason we have multiple days to give speeches in most classes. So the other thing we want to ask is, am I using this content in the context logically that it came from? Right? Am I using this content in the context logically that it came from? Am I pulling out one little part of that argument and using it for my own devices, or is it truly representative of what they say? I know I don't like to be quoted on a context. I would hate for you to walk away and quote me to somebody else and make me look like something that I'm not. And the same is true of any writer. Always want to be logical and fair as a listener and as someone who's digesting that information. Another aspect we want to look at is plagiarism. Hopefully you've heard this word before in your English class. You should either be taking it right now or have already taken it. Plagiarism is stealing, and it has to do with the ways that you could forge your speech and act like it was your own. So we talked about this a little bit on the day that we went over the syllabus, but maybe you watch a speech online and then you take diligent notes and then you give that exact same speech. Well, even that chronology, even the order in which that person put the points is intellectual property. You need to digest that information, understand it, come up with your own examples, rearrange it, and come at it as yourself. And then also, you need to cite that as one of your sources was that YouTube video that you based your speech on. So it's not that you can't use other people's ideas. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you have a discussion, but you always need to give a tribute to that person who you used. And anytime that you're quoting someone, so maybe you read a New York Times article about that, you would need to say out loud in the class, according to Ben Brantley in the New York Times in the September 2012 version of this article, right? You need to be very specific in laying out those sources so that we know where to go and double check that source for you. But you always need to make sure that your audience knows if you're quoting as well, right? To be or not to be, that is the question. Well, it may seem obvious to you that people know that's Shakespeare, but you would still need to say, according to the words of Shakespeare, to be or not to be, that is the question. You always need to lay out those quotes so that people understand that they are quotes. So, as we look at intentional plagiarism, we also need to realize that some people accidentally plagiarize. Some of you who have really good memories, this could be a curse. If you hear a speech and you start saying those exact same word patterns, then that is unintentionally stealing from that person. You need to make sure you've chewed it up, digested it, and are spitting it back out in your own words, the way you would understand or create it. So if you're going to quote them, if you're going to show a video, then go ahead and do that. Do not represent them exactly and say their words word for word. And never say in my class, I'm not sure where I heard this, or I read in a book once, or sources say. That sort of vague attribution to somebody somewhere is unacceptable. You need to be specific. You need to make sure that you know exactly who said that, because you've got to double check yourself and your own memory, right? You don't want to say that somebody said that and without not really knowing what they said. So always make sure to clearly indicate who said it first, and that you're being ethical and fair in the way that you use that person's information, So let's look at a couple case studies. I'm going to read these and then let's talk about them. Recently, at a regional university, 3 instructors of the basic public speaking course encountered a large number of students giving an informative speech about dreams. One instructor of a night class had at least 5 students give a speech about dreams on the same night. Right? So if I have 3 sections of speech right now, and if I were to hear multiple people give the exact same speech topic with the exact same sources, then I would then maybe look into it. Well, if I discover that they all went to high school together and now they're all presenting the exact same speech, I might think that maybe they are listening or working together somehow and not working alone. In speech, it's very important that you are creating your own thing that you're presenting. And if you are on a group project, say in a business world, then you need to give equal credit. This is something in the 80s that was happening to women a lot, right? Women were only given certain positions, and then men were presenting their information and taking the credit for it. So part of the legislation and the glass ceiling and coming to women empowerment was making sure that credit was given to who did the work, right? If the researcher found that information, then the boss would need to say, well, thanks to this person for finding that information. It doesn't need to be one person taking credit for everything. Another thing to think about in the business world when this translates is your intellectual property sometimes becomes the property of the business. So if you invent something while you're working in a lab, you, for example, cure cancer, right? And you're working in a lab, well, that intellectual property now becomes that of the business. So your intellectual property then can be attributed to the person who's investing time and money into you. So something to think about when you're getting a job, and when you sign those contracts, look and see their ideas of the legally who owns what, because it's sort of interesting. So a different case study here. Dr. Lisa Perez supervises several graduate teaching assistants at her university. As part of her duties, she observes each teaching assistant's class at least once per semester. Today, she is observing Matt, who is a new graduate student and teaching assistant. During Matt's lecture, he gives students incorrect information about a major concept. What does Dr. Perez do? And this is something that I have to battle in my class, right? Sometimes it's just an oversimplification of an issue. I had a student give a speech about Asperger's, and they used a lot of generalizations based on their one cousin that they had who had Asperger's. But it's not always safe, especially when it comes to syndromes like that that are very mysterious, to generalize, to say that this person had trouble passing their classes because of their syndrome is not representative of the entire Asperger's community. In fact, a lot of the students that I spoke and taught in classes were very intelligent, perhaps even more intelligent, because they had wonderful retention and obsessive educational pursuits. So it's not always fair to sort of generalize about a group based on one person's perception. And that would be a case of unfairly using data. Because you saw one person do that, that doesn't mean they represent everybody. So it's always important when you're speaking publicly to make sure that you're fairly evaluating and understanding. And it's part of my duty as an ethical teacher to correct you. And that's not always fun, because sometimes I have to correct you in front of everybody, right? Which can be really awkward. I know this is a short lecture, but I do just want to remind you, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. If you're going to use other people's ideas, give them credit. If you're going to understand a topic, make sure that you read the entire book before you quote that book. You need to understand your sources and really have a deep knowledge of something before you pretend to be an expert about it. Sometimes in our pride and in our selfishness, we can sort of front or put on a facade of understanding, but in a public speaking situation, that is grossly unethical. Please do your research, please do the hard work, and it will pay off. Thank you for listening.